The drive into Ridgefall on a Tuesday night in October took exactly 11 minutes from the moment Cole Hale turned off the gravel ranch road and onto the state highway. He had made this drive so many times that his hands knew the curves before his eyes did. The headlights of his black pickup truck swept across the dark fields on either side, catching nothing but dry grass bending in the wind and the occasional white flash of a fence post standing at attention in the dark. Nobody at the ranch knew he did this. Not his father, not the ranch hands, not even the two little girls sleeping in their beds back at the house who believed their father was simply someone who appeared each morning at the kitchen table with coffee already poured and boots already laced. Cole Hale drove into town every Tuesday night to buy a newspaper he did not need, drink a cup of coffee he did not particularly want, and sit alone inside the Ridgefall train station for exactly 20 minutes before driving back home. He had started doing it the winter after Anna died. He could not have explained why the train station specifically. There was something about it, the way it existed between things, between arrivals and departures, between one life and another. It was a place where nobody expected anything from you. The ticket window closed at 6 in the evening. The next train in either direction would not arrive until morning. The benches were hard, and the fluorescent lights hummed like something half asleep, and the whole building smelled faintly of old wood and cold concrete, and none of that mattered, because what mattered was that nobody in that room needed Cole Hale to be anybody at all for 20 minutes. That was the only thing he truly needed and could not find at home. He pulled into the small lot beside the station and turned off the engine. He sat for a moment in the silence, which was different from the silence at the ranch. The ranch silence had texture and weight. It had the sound of horses shifting in their stalls and floorboards settling in the cold and two small girls breathing behind a closed door at the end of the hall. The ranch silence was full of things that needed tending. The station silence was empty in a way that felt almost generous. Cole got out of the truck. The October air came at him hard and clean, carrying the cold of the high Wyoming plains, a cold that did not ease you into itself but simply announced that it had arrived and intended to stay. He turned up the collar of his canvas coat and walked to the station door, and he pushed it open the way he always did without hurrying. He stopped just inside the entrance. He had expected, as he always expected, to find the place empty. In 3 years of Tuesday nights, he had shared the station with another person exactly twice. Once a young man who had missed his connection and spent the whole time talking loudly into his phone. Once an older couple who had been arguing quietly in the corner and had not acknowledged Cole at all. Both times he had felt the intrusion keenly and had drunk his coffee faster than usual. Tonight there was a woman sitting on the last wooden bench against the far wall. She was young, somewhere in her mid-20s, and she was sitting in the way that people sit when they are trying to take up as little space as possible. Her coat was thin for the weather, a dark gray thing that looked like it had been bought for a different climate entirely. A small brown leather suitcase sat between her feet on the floor, and her hands were folded in her lap over a piece of paper that she was not reading anymore, just holding the way you hold something that used to mean more than it currently does. Cole looked at her for a moment before she looked up. When their eyes met, he noticed two things in quick succession. The first was that her face held the expression of someone who had been hoping not to be seen and had now been seen and was bracing for whatever came next. The second was that the expression underneath that one, the expression she could not arrange away quickly enough, was something he recognized. It was not sadness exactly. It was not fear. It was the look of a person who had learned somewhere along the way that stillness was safer than being noticed. He had seen that expression before. He had seen it on the faces of his daughters in the weeks after their mother died, in those early mornings, when they would wake up and lie very quietly in their beds, not calling for him, waiting to see how the world intended to behave before committing to any response of their own. Cole walked to the ticket window out of habit. It was closed as it always was. He turned and looked at the room. Then he walked toward the bench, stopping a few feet away from the woman close enough to speak without raising his voice. "Late night to be sitting alone," he said. She did not answer immediately. She looked at him the way people look at strangers in empty rooms after dark, weighing things quickly. Then she said quietly, "The train already left." "I figured," Cole said. He looked at the suitcase between her feet. Small. One bag. Either she packed light, or she had not planned to stay long, or she did not own much. All three possibilities were present in the same object. "Traveling far?" he asked. "Not anymore," she said. Cole studied her face for a moment. In his experience, people who answered questions that way were either being deliberately vague or they were telling the truth more completely than a longer answer would have allowed. He had a feeling it was the second one. "My name is Cole Hale," he said. He did not hold out his hand. He never did with strangers anymore. He had discovered after Anna died that the handshake ritual felt hollow in a way it had not before all that reaching across space to confirm something that might not be true. The woman hesitated. Something passed across her face, a small internal debate that was over quickly. "Clara Wells," she said. Cole Hale went very still inside. He did not show it. After 35 years of living in a place where weather could change in 30 minutes, and a horse could spook at nothing, and a fence could break on the coldest morning of the year, he had learned to keep his reactions quiet and quick on the inside and steady on the outside. It was a skill that had served him well in more situations than he could count. But the name Wells landed in him like a stone dropped into deep water, sending ripples downward into things that had been undisturbed for a long time. He let none of that reach his face. "You were supposed to be met somewhere," he said. It was not a question. Clara looked at him. Then she looked down at the paper in her hands. "I thought I was," she said. "I was wrong." Cole said nothing for a moment. He had learned long ago that silence after a difficult statement was not cruelty. It was respect. It was the acknowledgement that some things did not need to be rushed into explanation or comfort. He let the statement stand the way it deserved to stand. Then from the direction of the station entrance, he heard the sound that changed everything about that evening. Two sets of small feet running on concrete. The sound of children who have been sitting still longer than they were made to sit still and have finally been given the chance to move. "Daddy!" And then half a second later, the second voice, higher, a little breathless. "Daddy, Grandpa said you were here." Cole turned. The twins came through the station doorway like they came through every doorway at full speed and in tandem, their brown hair wild from the truck ride with their grandfather, their small red coats identical down to the last button. Lily hit him first, as she almost always did, because Lily had never in her 5 years understood why you would walk towards something when running was an option. June came a half step behind, more measured even at full speed, watching the room with those careful eyes that reminded Cole so much of Anna that there were still mornings he had to look away. He caught them both. He always caught them both. His arms had developed a kind of automatic geometry for this exact situation over 5 years of practice. "You two were supposed to be asleep," he said. "I couldn't sleep," Lily announced. June kept kicking. "I was not kicking," June said with the dignity of someone presenting evidence. Lily took all the blanket. Cole pulled them both closer for a moment and felt, as he always felt in this moment, the gratitude of a man who has been given more than he deserved and knows it. Then he set them down and they both turned at exactly the same moment, the way twins sometimes do, as if they share a single set of eyes, and they looked at the woman sitting on the bench. Children notice things that adults had learned to pretend not to notice. Lily whispered it, but the station was quiet enough that the whisper carried, "Daddy, she looks sad." Clara looked down quickly. She shifted the paper in her hands and fixed her gaze on the middle distance, the practiced retreat of a person who has been seen too clearly and does not know how to receive that seeing. June stepped forward. She crossed the distance between her father and the stranger on the bench with the same unself-conscious confidence she brought to everything, the kind of confidence that belongs only to very young children and very old men who have stopped caring what anyone thinks. She stopped in front of Clara and looked up at her. "Hello," she said. Clara looked up from the middle distance. She blinked once. "Hello," she said. "Why are you sitting here?" June asked. "I'm waiting for morning." June considered this. It was the kind of answer she took seriously because June took most answers seriously. She stood with her small hands clasped in front of her and thought about it. Then she said, "We have a house. Grandpa makes sweet bread." Cole watched Clara Wells hear those words. He watched the careful shield she had been holding in front of herself waver slightly, the way a candle flame wavers when a door opens somewhere in the house, not going out but bending under something invisible. He told the girls to go wait by the door. They obeyed with the reluctance of children who are very interested in what is going to happen next, but have not yet developed the vocabulary to argue effectively about it. They retreated to the entrance and stood there watching Lily with undisguised curiosity, and June with her arms folded and her head tilted at the angle that meant she was still thinking. Cole stepped closer to the bench. He did not sit down. He stood and looked at Clara Wells for a moment, this woman whose name had dropped into him like a stone in deep water. This woman who had arrived in Ridgefall on a Tuesday night in October with one small bag and a piece of paper she was not reading anymore. He did not entirely understand what he was about to say. He only knew that he had spent 3 years making every decision about his life with careful deliberation, turning things over and examining them before committing to any direction. And that this was one of those moments when something moved in him before deliberation had a chance to catch up. "My daughters need someone like you," he said. The words were quiet. They were not dramatic, but they landed in the room the way the first serious words of the evening always land heavier than everything that came before them. Clara went completely still. She looked up at him with an expression he could only describe as the face of a person who had just been handed something they had stopped believing anyone would offer. Not joy, not yet. Something more careful than joy, something that looked at the offered thing and could not quite trust that the offering was real. "You don't know anything about me," she said. "I know enough," Cole said. "You've known my name for about 4 minutes." "I know how you listened to June just now," he said. "She's 5 years old and she walked up to a stranger in an empty train station at night and started talking. Most adults either ignore children or talk down to them. You did neither. You answered her like what she said was worth answering." He paused. "I know what that costs a person who's tired and cold and has had a difficult day." Clara shook her head slowly. "You shouldn't say things like that to strangers." "I don't say things I don't mean," Cole said. The station held the silence between them. Outside, the October wind moved along the side of the building with a sound like something being dragged slowly across rough ground. Somewhere far off in the dark, a freight train was passing on the main line, its horn distant and low, the sound of something in transit between places. Clara looked toward the twins standing at the entrance. Lily had given up pretending not to watch and was staring with open interest. June had her head tilted in the other direction now, as if approaching the question from a new angle. "I don't have anywhere to go until morning," Clara said. "Come to the ranch tonight," Cole said. "Just tonight. In the morning you can decide whatever you want to decide." She looked at him for a long time. "Just tonight," she said finally. Cole nodded once. "That's enough." The truck held them in its quiet on the drive out. Clara sat in the passenger seat with her small suitcase between her feet on the floor, her hands folded in her lap in the same position they had held the paperback at the station. The twins had claimed the back seat and were conducting a murmured negotiation about who had the better view of the passing darknesses outside a negotiation that gradually lost momentum and then stopped entirely somewhere around the 6-minute mark as Lily's head dropped sideways onto June's shoulder and June's eyes went distant and slow. Cole drove without speaking for a while. He was used to this road in the dark. He had driven it in rain and in snow, and in the flat black of new moon nights when the fields on either side disappeared entirely, and the truck felt like it was moving through nothing. He knew every curve and dip by the way his body leaned in anticipation of them. He asked her one question. "What brought you to Ridgefall?" She told him simply, without embellishment, the way people tell stories that still hurt, keeping the facts close to the surface and the meaning underneath where it was harder to reach. She had received a letter 6 weeks ago from a family at a place called Red Oak Farm outside of town. The letter had promised her work in a room and something that sounded in the language the letter used like belonging. She had come 2 days by train from Portland at When she knocked on the door of Red Oak Farm, the woman who answered had looked at her for 3 seconds and said, "You're not what we expected," and closed the door. Cole did not say he was sorry to hear it. He did not say that sounded terrible. He said quietly, "Dorothy Hargrove." Clara turned to look at him in the dark. "You know her," she said. "Everybody in Ridgefall knows the Hargroves," Cole said. He kept his eyes on the road. "Not in the way you know people you trust." He did not say more than that. Not because there was nothing more to say, because there were things that needed to be said correctly or not said at all. And he needed time to understand what the name Clara Wells had done to the careful order of things inside him before he could begin to say them correctly. The headlights found the ranch gate, and Cole slowed the truck and stepped out in the cold to unlatch it and swing it wide. He got back in and drove through, and the gravel road crunched under the tires. And ahead of them through the dark, the ranch house appeared with its lights burning warm and yellow in the windows. The two-story structure of heavy pine timber that his grandfather had built in 1952, and that had been added to and repaired and altered over the decades until it was less a single thing than a record of all the decisions the Hale family had made about what they needed and what they could do without. Clara looked at the house and the barns and the pasture fence disappearing into darkness, and she said nothing. But Cole caught in his peripheral vision the way her hands loosened slightly in her lap. He parked the truck near the house. In the back seat, both girls were fully asleep, Lily with her mouth open slightly, and June with her hands pressed together under her cheek, both of them tilted against each other like books that would fall without the support. Cole opened the rear door carefully. Clara had already opened hers. She looked at June for a moment, and then she lifted the child without making any production of it, settling the small weight against her shoulder with a sureness that was not the sureness of practice, but something more instinctive than practice. June did not wake. She made a soft sound and turned her face into the curve of Clara's neck and was still again. Cole lifted Lily. They walked to the house in silence, each carrying one daughter, and the porch light came on as they climbed the steps, triggered by their movement the way it always was, casting a circle of light on the old boards of the porch floor. And Cole thought with a clarity that surprised him that this was the most natural thing he had seen in 3 years. Two people walking toward a lit house at night, each carrying a child. He thought about what he would say to his father. Earl Hale was in the kitchen when they came through the door. He always was. Sleep had never come easily to the man, even in his younger years, and these days he rarely attempted it before midnight. He sat at the kitchen table with a newspaper spread before him and a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. And when he heard the door and looked up, his expression did the thing it always did when he was processing new information and preferred not to show it. It became very composed, very level. The face of a man who has learned that the first response to an unexpected thing is often the wrong response. He looked at Cole. Then he looked at the woman behind Cole holding June against her shoulder, and his gaze moved across her face in that unhurried way he had of looking at people, not impolite, not invasive, simply the survey of a man who believed that faces told the truth when posture and words were still deciding what to say. "You found them," Earl said. His voice was the same as always, low and unhurried, worn smooth by decades the way river rock is worn smooth by water. "Found them," Cole said. "And who might this be?" "Her name is Clara Wells," Cole said. "She'll be staying tonight." The paper in Earl Hale's hand stopped moving. It was a very small thing. If you had not been watching for it, you might have missed it entirely. The hands stopped, and then they began moving again, folding the paper with the slow, deliberate care of a man who is buying himself a moment of stillness while something inside him adjusts. "Wells," Earl said. "That's right," Clara said. Earl looked at her directly then, and something passed through his eyes that had nothing to do with the ordinary assessment of a stranger in your kitchen at night, something that arrived from further back than tonight, from some earlier place that had been waiting a long time for a knock on a particular door. "Where are you from?" he asked. "Oregon," Clara said. "Portland, most recently." "Most recently," Earl repeated, and there was something careful in the way he said it, not the way you repeat a phrase because you want clarification, but the way you repeat it because you are measuring how much it gives away. He stood up. He moved to the counter and filled a mug from the pot that he kept warm through the night, and he set it on the table. "Sit down," he said. "You look tired." It was not a warm welcome, but it was a cup of hot coffee placed in front of someone who needed it. Cole had learned growing up in this house that his father expressed most of what he felt through the practical, through the doing of small, useful things at the precise moment when they were needed. It was its own language, one that required patience to learn, but was entirely reliable once you understood it. Clara sat. She wrapped both hands around the mug and looked into it for a moment, and something in her shoulders released very slightly, like a tension that had been maintained so long it had become invisible until it wasn't there anymore. Cole put both girls to bed. He moved through the upstairs with the efficiency of long practice, removing their small coats and their shoes, and easing them under their covers in the room they shared, the walls of which were covered with their drawings, horses and mountains and large, colorful suns, the taxonomy of what mattered to two 5-year-olds living on a Wyoming ranch. He stood for a moment at the foot of their beds and watched them breathe. He did this often. He never fully understood why. Perhaps because breathing was the simplest evidence that the world was still doing what it was supposed to do. When he came back downstairs, Earl was still at the table. Clara was still at the table. They were not talking, but the silence between them did not have the feel of two strangers who had run out of things to say. It had the feel of something being held carefully. Earl had his hands flat on the table in front of him, not on his coffee cup, not on the newspaper, just his hands on the wooden surface the way a man rests his hands when he is thinking. Clara had taken off her thin coat and draped it over the back of the chair. Without it, she looked younger and somehow more substantial, at the same time as if the coat had been a kind of armor that had made her look both protected and diminished. Cole poured himself a cup of coffee and sat. For a while, the three of them were quiet together in the kitchen of the house that Earl Hale's father had built, and the only sounds were the settling of old timbers in the cold and the low whistle of wind around the corners of the eaves. "The guest room is made up," Earl said finally. He was looking at his hands. "It's not much, but the mattress is good and there are extra blankets on the shelf in the closet." "Thank you," Clara said. "This is a working ranch," Earl said. "We're up before 6. You don't need to be, but I mention it so you're not startled." "I'm used to early," Clara said. Earl looked at her, a long, measured look. "We'll see how it goes in the morning," he said. And then he stood up, folded his newspaper under one arm, and said goodnight to both of them without ceremony, and walked down the hall toward his room. Cole listened to his father's footsteps. He heard the door at the end of the hall open and close. Then he sat with his coffee and looked at the woman across the table from him. "He's not unfriendly," Cole said. "He's careful." "I understand careful," Clara said. Cole believed her. She went up to the guest room a short while later. Cole showed her where the extra blankets were and told her the bathroom was the second door on the left and that if she needed anything in the night, she should not hesitate. She thanked him in the quiet, precise way of someone who had been thanking people for small kindnesses her entire life without fully believing she deserved them. He listened to her door close. Then he stood in the hallway for a moment in the dark. Clara Wells. The name moved through him again, and this time he let it settle into the full weight of what it might mean. He had heard that name before, and not recently. He had heard it from his mother years ago in the way his mother sometimes mentioned things, without explaining them, as if certain facts were self-evident and required no context. He had heard it from his father once in a conversation that had ended in a way that made it clear the conversation was over. He had been a boy then, young enough that the adult world was still a landscape understood primarily by its edges and shadows by what was not explained rather than what was. He went back to the kitchen and picked up his phone. He looked at the time. It was almost 11. He thought about calling Earl right now, walking down the hall and knocking on the door and asking his father directly what the name Clara Wells had done to his face at the kitchen table tonight. He was 35 years old, and he knew how to ask his father a direct question when one was needed. But Earl had said in his own way that this was a conversation for another time. And Cole had learned long ago to trust the timing his father placed on things. Earl Hale was not a man who delayed difficult conversations because he was afraid of them. He delayed them because he believed that some things needed to ripen correctly before they were ready to be held. Cole turned off the kitchen light and walked to the window and looked out at the dark ranch. The barn shapes against the sky, the pale line of the fence running toward the far pasture. The horses were in their stalls, and the cattle were in the winter pasture, and everything that was supposed to be in its place was in its place. He thought about the way Clara had lifted June from the truck without being asked, without hesitation, without asking if it was all right, without making it into a gesture that required acknowledgement. She had just done it the way you do something that is simply the next right thing and nothing more is needed. Anna would have noticed that. Anna had always been better than him at the noticing, at the reading of small evidences. She would have watched Clara Wells lift June, and she would have looked at Cole with that expression. She had the slight narrowing of one eye that meant she was filing something away for later, and he would have known what it meant, and they would not have needed to say it aloud. He pressed his fingers against the cold glass of the window and let himself miss her for exactly one moment, the way he allowed himself sometimes one full, honest moment of it, and then he let it go. In the morning, there would be work to do. There was always work. The ranch asked for it constantly and without apology, and Cole had learned to find a kind of relief in that asking in the clean and physical demand of things that needed doing. You did not have to understand anything about your own life to know that a horse needed feeding or a fence needed mending. The work was always there, and it was always true. He went upstairs and checked the girls one more time. They had migrated in their sleep as they always did. June now turned toward the wall, and Lily sprawled across nearly three-quarters of the bed with the territorial confidence of someone who had strong opinions about bedding. Cole adjusted the covers and stood at the foot of the beds for a moment in the dark. He thought about what his father's face had done when he heard the name Clara Wells. He thought about the small, brown leather suitcase sitting in the guest room at the end of the hall. He thought about a piece of paper that a woman had been holding in an empty train station, holding it the way you hold the last evidence of something you had counted on. He turned off the hall light and went to bed. He did not sleep for a long time. Morning came the way mornings always came to Hale Ranch in October, without announcement and without mercy. The sky went from black to the gray-purple of early mountain light, and the horses began their low, restless sounds in the barn, and the temperature in the unheated spaces of the house was enough to make your breath show if you stood near the window. Cole was in the kitchen at 5:45. This was not early for him. This was simply when morning began. He had the coffee made and was standing at the window looking out at the pasture in the first gray light when he heard Earl's door. His father's footsteps in the hall had a quality to them that Cole could read the way he could read whether something in the weight and pace that told him things before words were exchanged. These footsteps were different from the usual morning footsteps. They were slower, more deliberate, the footsteps of a man who has spent the night thinking. Earl came into the kitchen and looked at Cole, and then looked at the coffee and took a cup from the cabinet. He filled it. He stood with his back against the counter and looked out the same window Cole had been looking out. For a while, neither of them spoke. "I called Victor Hargrove last night," Earl said. Cole turned from the window. "After I went to my room," Earl continued, "I called him." He looked into his coffee. "I didn't tell him anything. I just told him the name of the woman staying here." He paused. "I wanted to hear what he did with it." "What did he do with it?" "He went quiet," Earl said. "The way a man goes quiet when you've said the name of a thing he thought was finished." Cole waited. His father looked out the window at the lightning sky, and Cole could see him working towards something moving through the interior of a long history toward a place he intended to arrive at. "There are things I need to tell you," Earl said, "about Eleanor Wells, about the land on the east side of the county, about a summer a long time ago, and a decision I made for the wrong reasons." He set his cup down on the counter and turned to face his son directly. "Not this morning, not while she's upstairs and I don't know enough yet about what she knows. But soon, before this goes any further." Cole looked at his father. The man was 67 years old and had not changed much in the essential ways since Cole was 20, since the day Cole had come back from his 1 year of agricultural college in Fort Collins, because the ranch needed a second set of hands and there was nobody else. The hair had gone silver. The lines in his face had deepened. The bad hip from the surgery last year had made his gait slower and more effortful than it used to be. But the eyes were exactly the same. They were the eyes of a man who had been fair and sometimes wrong, and who understood the difference between those two things. "All right," Cole said. Earl nodded. He picked up his coffee again. "The girl knows how to carry a sleeping child without waking her," he said. "That's not nothing." "No," Cole said. "It's not nothing." They stood at the window together and watched the light change over the ranch, the sky going from gray-purple to the pale amber that preceded full daylight, the pasture emerging slowly from the dark, with the horses moving against the fence line like slow dark shapes, and the whole thing so familiar and so complete that it was possible for one quiet moment to believe that nothing beyond it was complicated at all. Then they heard the sound of small feet on the stairs, then the sound of a second pair of small feet, and a whispered argument about who was going to ask Clara if she was awake, and then a knock on the guest room door, careful and precise, which was June, and then a less careful knock almost immediately after, which was Lily. Earl looked at Cole. There was something in his face that Cole had not seen there in a long time. Not happiness exactly. Something older and more specific than happiness. The look of a man who recognizes that a moment, whatever it carries beneath it, is also simply good. "Go start on the barn," Earl said. "I'll handle breakfast." Cole put on his coat and his hat and went out through the back door into the cold morning, and behind him, through the wall of the house, he could hear the kitchen coming alive with the sounds of his daughters and the creak of the cabinet where the mixing bowls were kept, and the low voice of his father beginning to explain to whoever would listen how you made sweet bread properly in a cast-iron skillet in a kitchen in Wyoming when the sky outside was the color of early light and the day was still deciding what it intended to be. He walked to the barn. He had taken about 20 steps when he stopped. In the suitcase upstairs in the guest room, there was almost certainly more than clothes. There was almost certainly something that told the story of where Clara Wells had come from. In his experience, people who traveled with one bag and held letters in empty train stations were people who carried their history close, who kept the essential things within reach because they had learned that things left behind had a tendency to disappear. He had a feeling that whatever she carried with her would be relevant to what his father intended to tell him. He had a feeling with the clarity that came sometimes from things he could not entirely explain that the 20 minutes of Tuesday night solitude he had been protecting for 3 years had ended last night and was not coming back. He did not know how he felt about that. He walked on toward the barn. The horses heard him coming and shifted in their stalls, and Stormlight, the brown one that had belonged to Anna, and that Cole had kept because getting rid of him had never felt like an option, pressed his nose to the stall door and watched Cole come down the center of the barn with those calm and attentive eyes that horses have when they trust you completely. Cole stopped at the stall. He rested one hand on Stormlight's broad nose and felt the warmth of the animal's breath against his palm. "All right," he said to the horse, which was what he said when he was thinking about something and the thinking was not yet finished. The barn was warm with the collective heat of the animals and the smell of hay and the old smell of horses themselves, and outside the walls of it, the Wyoming morning was continuing to arrive. And inside the house across the yard, his daughters were asking questions about sweet bread, and the woman who had come in the night was sitting at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, and his father was moving around the kitchen with the careful economy of a man who has something to say and is choosing the right time to say it. Cole thought about Clara's face when he had said his daughters needed someone like her, the way the careful shield had wavered, the way something underneath it had moved like a thing that had been very still for a very long time. He thought about his father's face when he heard the name Wells. He thought about the weight and pace of Earl's footsteps this morning, the footsteps of a man who had spent the night with something. The light was fully up now, the cold amber of early morning filling the barn through the doors he had left open behind him, and Stormlight had decided that the hand on his nose was fine, but he would prefer breakfast, and was expressing this preference in the direct and uncomplicated way that horses always express their preferences. Cole reached for the feed. Whatever his father needed to tell him, he would tell him. Whatever the name Clara Wells meant to the history of this ranch and the county beyond it, it would emerge in its own time the way buried things always emerged when the conditions were finally right. For now there was feed to pour and stalls to muck and a fence on the north side that had 3 posts that needed checking and a full day of work that would ask nothing of him except his attention and his effort. And in the house behind him, a woman was sitting at the kitchen table who had arrived with one small bag and a piece of paper. She wasn't reading anymore, and 2 little girls were asking her questions she didn't expect to be asked. And somewhere in the plain and ongoing fact of all of this, something had already begun that none of them could take back even if they wanted to. Cole did not want to. That was the thing he understood in the quiet of the barn, with the morning coming through the open doors more clearly than he had understood anything in a long time. He did not want to. 2 weeks passed before Clara Wells used the word staying. She did not use it directly. She used it the way people use words they are not yet ready to commit to, fully sideways and without emphasis embedded in a sentence about something practical. She said on a Thursday morning, while helping Earl move canned goods from the mudroom to the kitchen pantry, that she was going to need heavier socks if the weather kept doing what it was doing. Earl had handed her a can of tomatoes and said nothing. But that evening he placed a pair of wool socks on the small table outside the guest room door without explanation, and Clara had picked them up the next morning without comment, and that was how the conversation happened at Hale Ranch, mostly without words. She had not taken the morning train to Denver on the first day. She had told herself she would take the afternoon one. Then the afternoon one came and went while she was in the barn, watching Lily explain to Stormlight, with great earnestness and considerable inaccuracy, the plot of a story she had heard at her preschool. The next morning, Clara had gotten up at 5:30 without being asked and helped Earl with the breakfast dishes, and by the time Cole came in from the first round of barn chores, there had been no further discussion about trains. The ranch had a rhythm that was not complicated but was entirely unforgiving. It did not pause for adjustment or uncertainty. It simply continued early and cold and full of small necessary tasks, and Clara found that she slotted into it without effort. She was not from ranch country. She had grown up in a system that moved her from one temporary place to another, each with its own rules and schedules and unspoken expectations, and she had learned to read the requirements of a new environment quickly because the cost of not reading them quickly had always been too high. What she had not expected was that reading the requirements of Hale Ranch would feel like something other than survival. Cole noticed. He noticed without appearing to notice, which was his way of doing most things. He saw that she anticipated what needed doing a half step before being told. He saw that she handled the twins with a patience that was not performed, not the bright artificial patience of someone trying to make a good impression, but the real kind, the kind that comes from a person who genuinely finds children interesting rather than merely manageable. He saw that she ate whatever Earl put on the table and thanked him without the excessive gratitude that made both men uncomfortable. He saw that she sat on the porch steps in the evenings rather than in the chairs, and he understood that this was her way of reminding herself she was still a guest rather than a resident, and he did not comment on it because he understood why a person might need to maintain that fiction for a while. Earl watched her differently, with the specific contained attention of a man processing something that went deeper than the ordinary business of getting to know a new person. 3 times in those 2 weeks, Cole caught his father on the verge of beginning the conversation he had promised to have. The first time was after dinner on a Sunday night when the twins were in bed and the 3 adults sat in the kitchen in the silence of people who have shared a long day of physical work and are comfortable in each other's company without requiring it to mean more than it means. Earl had turned his coffee cup in his hands and opened his mouth, and then June had called from upstairs for a glass of water, and by the time that was sorted, the moment had closed. The second time was in the barn on a cold Wednesday morning. Cole had found his father standing at Stormlight's stall, watching Clara work a brush along the horse's flank with long, unhurried strokes. Earl had something in his expression that Cole recognized as the face he wore when he was working up to a difficult thing, and Cole had stopped beside him and waited. But then Lily had come running in from outside with a discovered treasure in the form of a particularly interesting rock, and the moment dissolved into the practical matter of explaining the rock's geological significance, about which Earl knew considerably more than anyone had expected. The third time, Earl had simply looked at Cole across the dinner table and given him the small nod that meant soon, and Cole had nodded back, and that was where it stood. On the 14th day, a Thursday, Cole took the truck into town for hardware, and Earl drove the twins to their preschool in the smaller vehicle, leaving Clara alone in the house for the first time since she had arrived. She cleaned. She cleaned the kitchen, already clean enough, and the living room already tidy enough, and the hallway floor that Earl mopped every Monday. She did it because she needed to do something with her hands, and because she was aware, with a low persistent awareness, that she had been managing for 2 weeks, that she was living inside a situation that she did not entirely understand, and that the not understanding of it had begun to press against her with more insistence than she could comfortably ignore. She was on the upper floor running a dust cloth along the shelf above the guest room closet when she knocked the cardboard box. It was sitting under the bed, pushed back against the wall, and she only saw it because she was on her knees looking for the dust cloth she had dropped. The box was not closed completely. The flaps of the lid were folded one over the other in the way you fold them when you intend to put something away temporarily and never quite get back to it. One corner had lifted slightly, and through the gap, Clara could see the edge of something that was clearly a book, brown leather, worn at the corners. She sat back on her heels and looked at it. She should have pushed the box further under the bed and moved on. She knew that. This was not her room, not really. It was the guest room, which was a category of room that existed specifically to remind its occupant that they did not have full rights to the space. She should have left it alone. But the box had already been half open when she found it, and when she lifted the lid to refold the flaps properly, the leather book shifted and fell open in her hands to the last written page, and the first line was already there before she had decided whether to read it. The handwriting was a woman's, precise and regular in most places, but looser here at the end, as if the writer's hand had been working against something. The date in the upper corner was March 14th, 2021. This was Anna Hale's diary. Clara should have closed it. She read the first line, and the first line would not let her close it. Cole, if you are reading this, then I am already gone. Don't grieve too long. You are not good at grieving, and you are very good at working and loving, and those are the things our girls need from you more than anything. Clara sat on the floor with the book open in her hands and her back against the bed, and she read slowly, the way you read something that demands to be read carefully because you sense that each sentence is carrying more weight than sentences usually carry. But there is something I need to tell you before I run out of time to tell it. There is a woman coming. I don't know her name. I don't know where she is coming from. But I know she will arrive when she has lost everything, and that is when Lily and June will need her most. You will recognize her because you recognize me the same way, not because I was beautiful or accomplished, but because you saw who I actually was within one afternoon. Trust that instinct. Don't be afraid of it. And Cole, ask your father about the Wells family. It is time. Clara read the last lines 3 times. Then she closed the diary and sat with it in her lap on the floor of the guest room and looked at the wall directly across from her, which had a window, and through the window was the pasture and the fence line and the mountains beyond that had been there since before anyone in the Hale family was born and would be there long after. She sat with it for a long time. There were 2 ways to understand what she had just read. The first was that it was coincidence, the wildest and most improbable coincidence of her life. A dead woman's words in a living woman's arrival rhyming with each other in a way that meant nothing, except that the world was sometimes stranger than any reasonable framework could contain. The second was that there was something operating beneath the surface of events that she could not yet see clearly, some connection between Eleanor Wells and Anna Hale, and this ranch and the county beyond it that went further back than Clara's arrival 3 weeks ago. She thought about the photograph. It was in her suitcase. It had been in her suitcase for 8 years since the day she had turned 18, and the state of Oregon had handed her a cardboard box containing the sum total of her mother's possessions that had been held in storage. The photograph was black and white, slightly overexposed at the edges, showing a young woman in her mid-20s standing in front of a large wooden house with a covered porch. The woman was smiling at whoever was holding the camera, a smile that suggested she was comfortable with that person, and behind her the house had the look of a place that had been built to last rather than to impress, and in the sky above the roofline were the kinds of mountains that belonged to a specific geography. On the back of the photograph in her mother's handwriting, Hale Ranch, Wyoming. Summer 1998. Clara had carried that photograph for 8 years and had never known where Hale Ranch was. She had never known if it still existed. She had known nothing about it except that her mother had stood in front of it once in the summer of 1998, and that someone whose company Eleanor Wells had enjoyed had been standing behind the camera when she smiled. Clara went to her suitcase and found the photograph and brought it back to the window. She held it up and looked through the glass at the house in front of her, and then back at the photograph, and then at the house again. The porch was the same. The line of the roof line was the same. The 2 rocking chairs visible at the left edge of the photograph were the same chairs that still sat on that porch, older. Now the wood darkened with years of weather and use. She had been standing in the right place all along and had not known it. That evening, after Cole brought the girls home and Earl made dinner and the ordinary business of the evening moved through its familiar sequence, Clara waited until the twins were in bed. Then she went to the kitchen with the photograph. Earl was at the table. Cole was on the other side of the room with his back to the counter. Clara set the photograph down in the middle of the table without saying anything. Earl looked at it. His hands, which had been resting on the table in that flat, deliberate way they sometimes rested, went very still. Cole watched his father. He watched the stillness spread through the older man, the kind of stillness that happens when something you have been carrying finally makes contact with the ground. "You know her," Clara said. It was not a question. Earl was quiet for a long moment. Then Eleanor Wells. She worked here the summer of 1998, cooking mostly, some of the lighter ranch work. She was here from late May through early September. He looked at the photograph. She was one of the finest people who ever worked on this ranch. "She was my mother." "I know," Earl said. "I knew it the night you told me your name." "Then why didn't you say anything?" Earl picked up the photograph and looked at it the way a person looks at an object that is connected to something they have been carrying in a place that does not get aired out very often. Because there are things that need to be said right or not said at all, he said, and I needed to know what you already knew before I could understand where to begin. Cole came to the table and sat down. What followed was the conversation that Earl had been working toward for 2 weeks, and the conversation before that had been working toward for 25 years, and the weight of all that waiting was present in the room with them. Not oppressive exactly, but real. The way the weight of a long-held thing is always real when it is finally set down. Eleanor Wells had come to Hale Ranch in the spring of 1998. She had found the work through a posting in a Portland paper, the kind of seasonal agricultural work advertisement that circulated in those years through community boards and classified sections, and she had arrived in Ridgefall on a Greyhound bus with 2 bags and the kind of quiet competence that Earl said his wife Martha had recognized within the first hour. Eleanor was 23 years old. She had grown up in Central Oregon, had no living family, and had come east and south looking for work, and Earl believed for something harder to name than work. She was also the inheritor of a small parcel of land in the east part of Ridgefall County that had belonged to her grandfather, a man named Robert Wells, who had homesteaded there in the 1940s and had left it to Eleanor when he died in 1996. The land was not large, roughly 40 acres, but it sat at the intersection of 2 county roads and had access to the tributary of the Bitter Creek that made irrigation significantly more viable than most of the surrounding parcels. It was in the language of people who understood land in that county situated very well. Victor Hargrove had been trying to acquire it since Robert Wells died. He had approached Eleanor twice by mail before she arrived in Ridgefall and once in person during her second week at the ranch. Earl had watched the interaction from a distance and had not intervened. He had told himself it was not his business. He had told himself Eleanor was a capable adult who could handle her own affairs. Both of those things were true as far as they went. What was also true was that the summer of 1998 had been the second consecutive drought year, and Hale Ranch was in a tense negotiation with Victor Hargrove over access to the eastern water rights, a negotiation that had not yet concluded, and Earl had made a calculation that he had been making a different kind of peace with ever since. He had decided that involving himself in Eleanor's situation with Hargrove would jeopardize the water agreement, and the water agreement was what would get the ranch through another dry year. And the ranch was what his family depended on. He had chosen the ranch over standing up for a young woman who needed someone to stand up for her. Martha had known. She had not said it in those words. Martha had not been a woman who said things in those words. But Earl had seen it in the way she looked at him after Eleanor left in early September, and he had seen it in the way the name Hargrove landed in their house from that autumn forward, and he had seen it in the last year of Martha's life in the quality of silence that sometimes settled between them when certain things might have been said and were not. Martha had died in 2018, and that silence had never been broken. Eleanor left in the first week of September, Earl said. She was pregnant. We knew. She didn't tell us who the father was, and we didn't ask. Before she left, she gave Martha an envelope. He stopped. She said, if a young woman with the name Wells comes looking, give this to her. He reached into the inside pocket of his flannel shirt, which was where he had been keeping the envelope since the night Clara had arrived. It was a standard letter envelope, the manila kind yellowed at the edges with age. On the front, in handwriting that Clara recognized from the back of the photograph, were 2 words: for Clara. Clara looked at the envelope without touching it for a moment. Then she picked it up. Inside was a short letter and a separate page folded twice in a different hand. The separate page was from a lawyer, a Cheyenne attorney named Douglas Marsh, who had written in the precise language of a man who understood that what he was documenting might need to stand up to scrutiny later, that Eleanor Wells had come to him in August of 1998 to ask about her options regarding the parcel of land in Ridgefall County that she had inherited from her grandfather. He had advised her of the legal basis of her ownership. He had also noted in the formal and carefully chosen phrasing of a man watching something he could not stop, that the circumstances of the eventual transfer of that land, should it occur, should be examined carefully by any future claimant, as the conditions under which the transfer was being pressured did not appear to constitute free and voluntary consent. He had kept a copy. The letter from Eleanor was short. Clara read it once silently and then read it again. Cole and Earl waited. She knew, Clara said. She wrote this before she signed the deed. She already knew what was going to happen to the land. She looked at Earl, and she still signed it. She was 23 years old and pregnant, and Victor Hargrove had resources she didn't have, and time she didn't have, Earl said. She made the decision that kept her safe in the short term. That's what people do when they don't have anyone in their corner. He looked at his hands on the table. And she didn't have anyone in her corner. The kitchen was quiet. The land is on the east side of the county, Cole said. Hargrove has been running his breeding operation on it for 15 years. The land belongs to Clara, Earl said. Or it should, if the transfer was coerced, which Marsh's note suggests it was. He looked at his son. I should have said something in 1998. I didn't. I'm saying it now. Cole looked at his father for a long moment. The look between them contained things that did not need to be said aloud, the full complicated weight of a father and son who have been honest with each other for 35 years and are continuing to be honest now about something that would have been easier to leave alone. All right, Cole said. Then we figure out what's right and we do it. Later that night, after Clara had gone upstairs and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, Cole sat with the Anna question that had been sitting in him since the afternoon. He had read that last entry in Anna's diary years ago, on an evening 6 months after she died, when he had finally felt ready to open the book and found that he was not ready at all. He had read her words about a woman coming about the Wells family, and he had put the diary away and told himself what a man tells himself when grief and pain medication and the overwhelming weight of loss are all present in the same room. That it was the medication talking. That Anna had been far away from herself in those last weeks and had spoken from that distance. His mother had been close to Anna in the final years of Martha's life. The two women had spent long afternoons together in this kitchen, the older one and the younger one, and he had never thought to ask what they talked about. Now he wondered. Martha had carried the Wells secret for 20 years before Anna came along. Martha had been a woman who believed that certain things needed to be said before the time for saying them ran out. He wondered what Martha might have told Anna in those last months. What weight she might have finally set down with someone she trusted to carry it carefully. He sat with that thought for a while. Then he turned off the kitchen light. The following morning, a black SUV came through the ranch gate before 9 o'clock. It was a vehicle that announced its own significance in the way that certain vehicles do, large and dark and moving with the unhurried confidence of something that believes it has the right of way everywhere it goes. Dorothy Hargrove stepped out in a dark blue wool coat with the collar up her hair arranged with the precision of someone who puts on armor before going into difficult territory. Behind her came a man in a gray suit carrying a document folder, a lawyer by the posture and the watchful eyes. Cole had already seen the vehicle from the barn and had walked to the house. But it was Earl who opened the front door before Dorothy reached the porch steps. Earl stood on the top step and looked down at her with the expression of a man who has decided exactly what he is going to say and is not in any hurry to say it. Dorothy, he said, last time I saw you was at the Ramsey funeral, I believe. 2019. Dorothy looked up at him with a recalibration happening visibly behind her composed expression. She had come expecting to deal with a young woman from out of state who had no local standing and no local support. She had not expected to be greeted by Earl Hale on his own porch step. Earl Hale, who had known her and her husband for 4 decades and knew which conversations he had the standing to have and which ones he did not. Earl, she said with the careful evenness of a woman deciding how to play a hand she had not anticipated. I was hoping to have a conversation with your house guest. You're welcome to have a conversation with whoever you like, Earl said. But I think the person you really need to talk to is Victor. Tell him I have something he thought was gone a long time ago. Tell him I want him to come here and hear it from me directly, not through lawyers. The man in the gray suit opened his document folder, a reflex of the profession. Earl glanced at the folder and then at the man and then back at Dorothy. Whatever's in there can wait, Earl said. Victor and I have known each other since we were in our 20s. This is a conversation for people who have that history. Tell him to come. Dorothy looked at Earl for a moment longer. Then she looked past him at the house, and for 1 second her gaze crossed the window where Clara was standing just inside, and the two women's eyes met through the glass. Something passed across Dorothy Hargrove's face that was not calculation and was not contempt. Something much older than either of those things, something that seemed to recognize Clara not as a problem to be managed, but as a person she had been expecting in some complicated way. Then the moment closed. Dorothy turned back to her vehicle and said, without looking at the lawyer, "We're done here for now." The lawyer closed his folder. They got in the vehicle. It turned around in the drive and went back through the gate. Cole came to stand beside his father on the porch step. Earl watched the SUV until it turned onto the county road. "Victor will come," he said. "He'll want to know what I have before he decides how to proceed. That's how he's always operated." He turned and went inside. Good. Victor Hargrove came 3 days later. He came alone, which was the thing Cole noticed first. No lawyer, no Dorothy, just the man himself in a regular barn coat and boots that had seen actual use arriving in a truck that was practical rather than demonstrative, parking it at the gate and walking the short distance to the house on foot as if he wanted the walk to mean something. Cole met him outside. The two men stood in the open ground between the house and the barn, with the mid-morning light falling flat and cold over everything, and Cole studied Victor Hargrove with the straightforward attention he gave to any situation he needed to understand before responding to. Victor Hargrove was 58 years old and looked like a man who had spent most of his life in physical landscapes without being physically tested by them, which was a different kind of aging than the kind that showed on Earl or on Cole. He was heavy through the shoulders and deliberate in his movements, and his face had the weathered look of someone who spent time outdoors without the deeper lines of someone who worked outdoors, and his eyes were the eyes of a man who had spent decades being the most powerful person in every room he entered and had come to experience that condition as the natural state of things. He looked at Cole with the expression of a man who had come with a prepared approach and was already adjusting it. He said that he and Earl had a long relationship, that the history between their families was something he valued, that land disputes in rural counties were complicated matters with long roots, and that there were always multiple sides to a story, and that a young woman from out of state who had been told one version of events deserved to hear the full picture before drawing conclusions that could damage relationships that had taken decades to build. Cole let him finish. Then Cole said, "Do you know the name of the child Eleanor Wells was carrying when you pressed her into signing that deed?" Victor Hargrove did not answer. "Clara," Cole said. "The child's name was Clara. She's in that house right now." He held Victor Hargrove's gaze for a moment, letting the weight of those two sentences sit in the open air between them, and then he turned and walked back to the house and closed the door. Through the window, he watched Victor Hargrove stand in the yard alone for a moment before walking back to his truck. The man moved like someone whose calculation had just encountered a variable it had not included. He got in the truck and drove back through the gate and onto the county road. Cole stood at the window. Behind him, he heard Clara say quietly, "That was it. One sentence, or sometimes one sentence is the whole argument," Cole said. That afternoon, Beth Carson called Cole's phone. Beth was the town doctor, had been the town doctor for 12 years, and before that had been Anna's closest friend from nursing school. She was the only person in Ridgefall who said exactly what she thought to Cole's face and expected him to receive it without either argument or offense, which he did, because she was almost always right, and because she had been present in the worst days of his life, and he owed her more than he could easily calculate. She had heard about Clara. Ridgefall was a town of 800 people, and news moved through it the way water moves through soil, steadily and through every available channel. She wanted to meet Clara, which was what she said. What she also meant, Cole understood, was that she wanted to assess the situation with her own eyes before deciding what help to offer, which was also her way with everything. Cole drove Clara to the clinic that afternoon. Beth Carson was a small, direct woman with close-cropped red hair and the manner of a person who has spent 20 years being the person in the room who tells people things they are not happy to hear and has made peace with that role. She shook Clara's hand and looked her in the face for about 2 seconds before forming whatever conclusion she was going to form. She took Cole's coffee order, sent him to the waiting area with it, and brought Clara into her office. "The Hargroves have been the primary political and economic force in this county for 40 years, she said without preamble. "Victor Hargrove has outlasted 3 county commissioners, 2 sheriffs, and 1 district court judge, who made the mistake of ruling against him in a water rights case in 2008. Dorothy Hargrove runs every significant charitable organization in Ridgefall and knows which families have which vulnerabilities because she has been handing out help strategically for 3 decades. She folded her hands on the desk. They are not people who lose gracefully or quietly. Clara looked at her steadily. Are you trying to discourage me? I'm trying to make sure you understand what discouraging looks like when it comes from them, Beth said. Because it doesn't always look like a threat. Sometimes it looks like a rumor. Sometimes it looks like a legal notice that costs you $3,000 to respond to. Sometimes it looks like the people you thought were on your side suddenly finding reasons to be less available. She paused. I'm telling you this because you deserve to know what you're walking into, not because I think you should walk away from it. Clara said, then you think I should keep going. I think Eleanor Wells deserves someone to stand beside her in 1999, and nobody did. Beth said, I think you deserve better than the same outcome. The snowstorm came without warning on the third Thursday of November. Wyoming storms in that season had a reputation for arriving fast and moving faster, but this one outpaced even that reputation. Cole was 3 miles out with 2 ranch hands moving cattle toward the winter pasture when the sky changed. By the time he made the decision to bring everyone in, the visibility had dropped to something that required walking the horses by hand along the fence line to keep orientation. Earl was in the house with the twins and Clara. The girls had been home from preschool for an hour when the storm closed down the visibility outside to nothing. Earl stood at the kitchen window and watched the white come in from the north and felt his bad hip complain about the pressure drop and thought about what needed to be done to make sure the house was secure through what was coming. He was going through the mental inventory when Lily screamed from the living room, not a frightened scream, a scream of the specific and urgent variety that children produce when something bad is actively happening, rather than being anticipated. Earl moved faster than his hip appreciated. Lily was standing at the back door pointing outside. Dusty, the small brown dog they had acquired in October, was visible for a moment at the edge of the visibility, through the storm, running toward the open ground beyond the fence. And June was not in the room. Earl looked at Lily. Where did June go? She went after Dusty, Lily said with the anguish of a child who made a decision 1 second ago that has already become a catastrophe. I told her to wait. Earl looked at the door, and then at his hip, and then at the door. He knew the arithmetic before he finished thinking it. He was 67 years old with a surgically repaired hip that had been complaining since the storm front arrived, and the yard beyond the door had become a white absence in which direction was a matter of guessing, not seeing. He could not run. He could not even move quickly enough through that kind of ground cover to find a child before a child could get dangerously cold. He turned to say Clara's name. She was already in her coat. She did not ask for direction. She did not ask if there was a better option. She read the room in the 2 seconds it took Earl to process what he was seeing, and she made the calculation, and she was already at the back door pulling on her boots when Earl reached the kitchen. She did not have the right gloves. She did not have a hat. She went anyway. Earl stood at the window. He stood there and watched the white world outside and held his granddaughter's hand and could not do the one thing a man in his position most wants to do, which is go out himself and bring the child home. He stood with the full weight of his own limitations pressing down on him, which was a specific and particular kind of suffering that he had never before in his life been required to feel so completely. He thought about Eleanor Wells. He thought about 1998 and a young woman with no one to stand in her corner, and a calculation he had made that had seemed in the moment like responsible stewardship of what he was responsible for. He thought about the look in Martha's eyes afterward. He thought about 25 years of carrying something that did not get lighter with familiarity. He stood at the window, then the shape appeared in the white. 2 shapes. Clara coming through the storm with June against her shoulder. Both of them covered in snow. June's small face pressed into Clara's neck, the way a child presses into safety when safety is offered. Earl had the door open before Clara reached the steps. She came through the door, and the heat of the house came around them, and Earl reached for June, and Clara transferred the child into his arms, and June was cold and shaking slightly, but conscious and unhurt, still holding the dog pressed against her chest with both arms, and Earl stood in the kitchen doorway with his granddaughter and felt something release in him that had been held for a very long time. His shoulder moved. Once. The involuntary movement of a man who does not cry, but whose body sometimes disagrees with that policy. Clara saw it. She did not say anything. She went to the closet for the heavy blankets, and when she came back, she wrapped June first, and then seeing that Earl was still standing with the child and was not going to put her down anytime soon, she draped a blanket around both of them together. When Cole came in from the storm an hour later, stomping snow from his boots in the mudroom, Earl told him what had happened in the economy of words that the event had reduced it to. Cole listened without expression. He went upstairs and stood at the foot of June's bed and looked at his daughter, sleeping in the aftermath of the storm, warm and safe and entirely unaware of the algebra of risk that had been worked out on her behalf this afternoon. Then he came back downstairs and found Clara sitting beside the wood stove in the living room, with her hands around a cup of tea, her hair still damp, her boots still wet on the mat beside the door. He sat down beside her. There was no tactical purpose to it. He sat beside her because that was where he wanted to be, and he was done pretending otherwise to himself, which was not a decision he had arrived at through deliberation, but one that had already been made somewhere below the level of deliberation and was simply surfacing now. "You cold," he said. "I'm all right," she said. "Clara." She looked at him, and he saw for the first time since the night at the station the shield come all the way down. Not because she had decided to lower it, but because she did not have the energy to maintain it after the afternoon she had just come through. "Thank you," he said, 2 words, the most direct and honest thing he could offer. She looked at the wood stove. "She's fine," she said. "That's what matters." "Yes," Cole said, "she's fine." He stayed beside her until the tea was finished and the fire was burning well, and the house had settled back into the ordinary sounds of an evening in November, and he did not move away, and she did not move away, and neither of them said anything more about it because nothing more needed to be said. Sheriff Ray Dodds came to the ranch on a Friday morning, 3 days after the storm. He drove a county vehicle and he carried a document folder, and he wore the expression of a man who has been asked to deliver a message he is not comfortable delivering, which was an expression that suited him because Cole suspected he was not comfortable with quite a lot of what he was asked to do in this county. Dodds was 50 years old and had grown up in Ridgefall and had been elected sheriff twice on the strength of a reputation for quiet competence and the kind of local credibility that came from being known and trusted by enough people to win a county election. He was not a bad man. Cole had known him since they were boys, but he was a man who had made accommodation after accommodation with the realities of power in this county over the span of his career, and accommodations of that kind accumulated in a way that eventually made their reversal very difficult. The document was a legal notice from the office of Victor Hargrove's attorney. It stated that any claim by Clara Wells to land in Ridgefall County, based on allegations regarding the 1999 deed transfer, would be opposed vigorously in court, that the transfer had been executed according to all applicable laws and had been recorded properly with the county, and that pursuing such a claim would require a substantial investment of time and legal resources without any guarantee of outcome. Dodds read the relevant sections in the flat voice of a man reading something that is not his personal message, but whose delivery he has been recruited into. When he finished, he held the document out toward Cole. Cole did not take it immediately. He looked at Dodds. "Ray," he said, "you and I grew up here. You know this county the same way I know it. You know what happened to Eleanor Wells in 1999. Dodds held the document steady. He did not look away, but there was something happening in his eyes that was not the neutral compliance of official function. "This is a legal document," Dodds said. "I'm required to serve it." "I know you're required," Cole said. "I'm not asking about what you're required to do. I'm asking you to look at me and tell me you think what happened to that woman was right." Dodds was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he held out the document again, and Cole took it. Dodds turned to go. At the bottom of the porch steps, he stopped. He did not turn around. He spoke to the middle distance in front of him, toward the barn and the pasture beyond. "Margaret Pryor lives out on the Clearwater Road," he said. "She worked as a county clerk for 30 years and she retired in 2005. She doesn't drive anymore, so she relies on people to bring her into town when she has business there." He paused. "The county courthouse has hearings every Wednesday morning. I can't drive her myself, but I don't have the authority to prevent anyone else from offering." He walked to his vehicle. Cole watched him go. Then he went inside and called Beth Carson. What Beth told him that evening in the flat and precise manner she used to deliver important information was that Margaret Pryor had been waiting for a phone call for a long time. Pryor was 81 years old and had spent 30 years as a county clerk processing documents that she was sometimes not comfortable with and had sometimes been instructed to process without asking questions. The deed transfer of 1999 had been one such document. Eleanor Wells had come in to sign it on a Tuesday in March, and what Pryor had seen that day had sat with her ever since, not because she had wanted to carry it, but because she had not known who to give it to. What Pryor had seen Eleanor Wells arriving at the county office in the company of Victor Hargrove's attorney, visibly distressed eyes, red hands unsteady. Victor Hargrove himself standing in the corridor outside the room where the signing took place. Eleanor signing the document in less than 10 minutes. Eleanor leaving quickly without speaking to anyone. And Dorothy Hargrove standing at the recording desk afterward with a copy of the deed, a red pen, and the deliberate attention of someone making sure a task was completed correctly. The alteration was small. A single clause, the right of first refusal, that would have given Eleanor or her heirs the ability to reacquire the property within 20 years at the original sale price. The clause appeared in the draft document that Pryor had processed earlier that week. It did not appear in the recorded deed. Someone had removed it between the drafting and the recording. Pryor had watched Dorothy Hargrove at that desk with that pen. "She'll testify," Beth said. "She's been waiting for someone to ask." Cole sat with the phone in his hand after the call ended. Clara was at the table across from him. She had heard enough of the conversation to understand the shape of it, and she was looking at him with the expression she had been wearing more frequently over the past weeks, the expression of a person who is watching a situation become real in a way that requires a response she is not yet certain she has the resources to give. "It wasn't your father," Cole said. "I mean, he made a choice I wouldn't have made. But the deed itself, the alteration, that was Dorothy." Clara looked at the document folder on the table between them. "She was in the room," she said. "Not Victor." "Victor gave the order," Cole said. "Dorothy carried it out, and has lived with that for 25 years. Clara thought about the moment at the window 3 days ago, when Dorothy Hargrove's eyes had found hers through the glass. The thing that had passed across Dorothy's face in that second. Not calculation. Something older and more honest than calculation. "She expected me," Claire said quietly. Cole looked at her. "When she opened the door in Red Oak Farm," Clara said, "she'd been expecting me. That's what was in her face when she looked at me. Not surprise. Recognition." She was quiet for a moment. And then she closed the door because recognizing me was worse than not recognizing me. Cole didn't say anything for a while. Outside, the November night was clear and cold, and the stars over Wyoming were bright and close and indifferent to the things that mattered to the people beneath them. "There will be a hearing," Cole said, "with Pryor's testimony and the Marsh document, and what my father can say directly, there's a real case." He paused. "It won't be simple. Hargrove has resources and connections, and he's been in this county for 4 decades. But there's a case." "I know," Clara said. "I'm not asking you to decide tonight," Cole said. "I'm telling you that whatever you decide, you won't be going into it alone." Clara looked at him. The shield was still down, the way it had been down since the afternoon in the snow, and without it, her face showed things that he thought had probably been there all along, but had been carefully maintained just below the visible surface. "Your father made a mistake in 1998, she said, "and he's been carrying it ever since, and now he wants to fix it." She looked at the document on the table. "I understand that kind of carrying." "I thought you might," Cole said. They sat across from each other in the kitchen of the house that Earl Hale's father had built, and the night moved around the house the way Wyoming nights move with wind and cold, and the silence of large open country, and somewhere upstairs 2 small girls were sleeping through it all with the absolute confidence of children who believe, because the evidence supports it, that the people below them have things in hand. That night, long after Cole had gone to bed and the house had gone quiet, Clara sat at the kitchen table alone with the envelope from her mother and the legal document, and the awareness that she was for the first time in her life in a place where someone had offered to stand beside her before she had even asked. She thought about June pressing her face into her neck in the storm. She thought about Earl's shoulder moving that once involuntarily. She thought about Cole saying thank you in the way he had said it without decoration. 2 words that contained something much larger than 2 words. She thought about Lily, who had looked at her on that first night in the train station and said loudly enough for the whole room to hear that she looked sad. She was not sad now. She was frightened, which was different, and the distinction mattered, because frightened meant there was something worth being frightened of, something real and present, and worth the effort of protecting. She put her mother's letter back in the envelope. She left the legal document on the table. She went upstairs and stood for a moment at the door of the girls' room, which was cracked open the way it always was, and listened to the sound of two children sleeping in the way that children sleep when the people downstairs have things in hand. Then she went to bed. She slept. In the morning, there would be a great deal to do, and she intended to be present for all of it. The Wednesday morning of the hearing came in cold and clear, the kind of Wyoming morning that had no ambiguity about itself. The sky in an unbroken blue from horizon to horizon, and the air so sharp it made the edges of things look drawn rather than real. The mountains to the west stood in the early light with the clarity that followed storm systems, every ridge and couloir visible, as if someone had decided that today of all days there would be no softening of outlines. Cole was up at 4:30. He did not need to be. The hearing was not until 10. But sleep had released him at 4:30 with the firm finality of something that had completed its function and had no interest in continuing, and he had learned long ago not to argue with that. He made coffee and stood at the kitchen window in the dark and watched the ranch exist in the pre-dawn, the way it always existed, indifferent to what was happening inside the house, asking only for what it always asked: attention and effort and the willingness to show up again tomorrow. The horses were shapes in the darkness of the pasture. The barn was a solid mass against the slightly lighter darkness of the sky. The fence ran its line toward the east until it disappeared into what was not yet visible. He heard his father's door at 5. Earl came into the kitchen with the movement of a man who has also been awake for some time and has decided that lying in bed is no longer a productive use of the remaining darkness. He poured coffee. He stood beside Cole at the window. They were quiet together for a while. "I've been thinking about what I'm going to say," Earl said. "You don't have to rehearse it," Cole said. "Just say it the way it happened." Earl looked at the dark pasture. "The way it happened is not flattering to me." "No," Cole said, "it isn't. I want to be clear about that. In the room, I'm not going in there to make myself look like a man who did the best he could under the circumstances. I'm going in there to say what I did and why I did it and what it cost." Cole looked at his father. The profile of the older man in the kitchen, light the silver hair and the jaw set with the set of someone who has made a final decision and is done renegotiating with himself. He thought about all the mornings they had stood in this kitchen over 35 years, and how many of those mornings had required his father to be something specific, to be steady when the ranch needed steadiness and quiet, when the situation needed quiet and firm, when the animals or the weather or the finances needed firmness. He thought about how rarely he had seen his father need to be something that cost his father personally. Today was going to cost his father personally. "I know," Cole said. "Your mother would have done this 20 years ago," Earl said. "She would have found a way." "Probably," Cole said, "but you're doing it now." Earl was quiet for a moment. Then he went to refill his cup and the conversation was over in the way that certain conversations between men who have known each other for a long time are over. Not because they are finished, but because everything essential has been exchanged, and what remained could only be gotten through by getting through it. Clara came downstairs at 6. She was dressed already, which told Cole that she had also been awake for some time, and she had the focused quiet of a person who has moved through whatever internal processing needed doing and has arrived at the other side of it in a functional condition. She poured coffee and sat at the table and looked at the documents she had been reviewing for the past week. Not reading them, just keeping them in front of her, the way you keep a map in front of you when you already know the route. Earl made breakfast. He made it the same way he made it every morning, with the same economy of movement and the same attention to whether everyone's plate was full, and the ordinariness of the breakfast, its complete refusal to acknowledge that this was a different kind of morning, was itself a thing that Clara seemed to understand and appreciate. She ate. She thanked him. She took her plate to the sink. The twins came down at 7 and ate without being told that today was significant. They knew something was happening because the adults had the contained quality of people managing something large in their vicinity, but they did not press on it, and the morning moved through its sequence of small tasks and small negotiations until it was time to take them to Beth Carson's house, where Beth had offered to keep them for the morning, without making it into a larger offer than it needed to be. Cole drove the girls over. Lily asked 3 questions about where they were going and why Beth's house instead of preschool, and Cole answered each question accurately and briefly, and Lily accepted each answer with the slightly skeptical reception she gave to information that was technically sufficient but lacked dramatic detail. June sat beside her sister and looked out the window and said nothing, which was how June processed uncertainty by watching the landscape and thinking about it in the careful private interior that she maintained even at 5 years old. When Cole came back, Earl and Clara were already in Earl's truck. Cole got in his own truck and followed. The Ridgefall County Courthouse was a 2-story brick building on the main street of town that had been built in 1934 and had the solid and undemonstrative quality of public buildings from that era, buildings that were designed to represent the permanence of civic function rather than to impress anyone with the grandeur of their ambitions. The parking area beside it was already more than half full when Cole pulled in at 9:40, which meant something because the parking area held 40 vehicles, and hearings of the kind scheduled for this morning that did not typically fill parking lots. Cole sat in his truck for a moment after he turned off the engine. He was looking at the people walking toward the courthouse entrance. He knew most of them. He had known most of them his entire life. There was Tom Alcott from the hardware store, who had no stake in land disputes in the East County, but who was like most people in a small town, constitutionally unable to remain absent from something significant. There was Sandra Reeves from the county assessor's office, who had her professional reasons for attending. There was Jean Mallory, who had farmed on the south side of the county for 40 years, and whose relationship with Victor Hargrove was complicated in the way that all relationships with Victor Hargrove were complicated, built from layers of obligation and accommodation, and the private calculation of what could and could not be said in various company. These were the people who had been quiet for a long time. Cole got out of the truck. Inside, the hearing room held 40 seats arranged in rows before a raised platform where the county magistrate, a woman named Judge Helen Sato, who had been appointed 4 years ago and who had a reputation for patience and a shorter one for tolerance of procedural gamesmanship, sat reviewing documents with the focused attention of someone who had read everything available and was waiting for the in-person portion to add whatever it was going to add. Victor Hargrove sat at the respondents' table with 2 lawyers, both from Cheyenne, both wearing suits that announced their origin city clearly. Victor himself wore his barn coat, the same one he had worn to the ranch, and Cole wondered if this was deliberate, if it was the calculation of a man trying to read as local rather than as the version of himself that hired lawyers from the state capitol. Dorothy Hargrove sat in the front row of the public seating directly behind her husband, with her hands folded in her lap and her posture carrying the quality of controlled stillness that Cole had come to understand as her default mode when she was managing something she could not control through the usual methods. Clara sat at the petitioner's table with David Marsh, the land law attorney from Cheyenne, that Cole had driven 3 hours to meet and spent 2 hours persuading to take the case on terms that could be managed given Clara's resources. Marsh was 48 years old, deliberately plain in his presentation, and had the quality of focus that manifested in very still hands and very attentive eyes. He had reviewed everything and had said that the case was real. He had also said that it would be contested at every point, which they had both understood going in. Earl sat in the first row of the public gallery on the aisle. Cole sat beside him. The seat on Cole's other side was empty, and it was empty because the person who should have occupied it was sitting at the front table, and the gap where she was not was something Cole was aware of throughout the morning as a kind of negative presence. Margaret Pryor was brought in by Beth Carson at 2 minutes before 10, a small woman of 81 years who moved with a walker and whose eyes, despite everything that age had done to the surrounding architecture of her face, were sharp and present and entirely clear. She wore a dark dress that she had probably kept in her closet for years against the possibility of an occasion that required it, and she sat down in the chair that had been placed for her with the deliberate care of someone who intends to stay until the business is finished. The magistrate called the hearing to order. David Marsh presented the case with the economy of someone who had learned that judges respect preparation over performance. He laid out the timeline from 1996 through 1999, the inheritance of the Wells parcel, the documented pressure campaign, the deed transfer in March of 1999, and the Cheyenne attorney's contemporaneous note about the conditions of that transfer. He submitted the original note from Douglas Marsh, no relation, as documentary evidence, and requested that it be entered into the record. Victor Hargrove's lead attorney objected on grounds of hearsay and relevance. Judge Sato overruled with the brevity that indicated she had already considered and rejected the objection. Margaret Pryor gave her testimony first. She spoke in the measured, deliberate manner of a woman who had been organizing facts for professional purposes for 30 years and had not lost the habit. She described the deed transfer processing. She described Eleanor Wells arriving at the county office in March of 1999. She described what she had observed in the room where the signing took place and in the corridor outside it. She described Victor Hargrove's presence. She described her own position and her own decision at the time not to intervene. When she reached the part about the recording desk, her voice did not change in register or pace, but the room changed around it. The quality of silence that exists in a space where people are listening with their full attention rather than with the partial attention of people waiting to respond settled over the hearing room and stayed there. She described Dorothy Hargrove at the recording desk. She described the red pen. In the front row, Dorothy Hargrove did not move. But for 1 second, brief and involuntary, her eyes closed. 1 second only. Then they opened again, and she was still the way she was always still, and the room continued around her. Pryor described what had been in the draft document that she had processed earlier that week and what was not in the recorded deed. Victor Hargrove's attorney rose to cross-examine. The attorney was skilled and thorough. He spent 20 minutes working through the foundations of Pryor's account, her distance from the recording desk, the years elapsed since the event, the normal processes by which document errors were corrected. He was doing what he was paid to do, which was to introduce enough uncertainty about each individual element that the whole could not be held with confidence. Pryor held her ground with the patience of someone who has been holding things for a longer time and knows how. When the cross-examination was finished, Judge Sato looked at her notes and then looked up. "Is there additional testimony at this time?" she said. David Marsh stood. "Your Honor, I would call Earl Hale." The room did something that rooms do when a name carries weight that most people in the room understand. It shifted. A collective small adjustment of posture and attention, the physical expression of a community recalibrating what it thought it knew about the morning. Victor Hargrove turned and looked at Earl for the first time since the hearing began. Earl was already standing. He moved down the aisle with the careful deliberateness that his hip required, not slowly in the way of someone being cautious, but slowly in the way of someone who is moving at the pace that the situation deserves. He reached the witness chair and sat down and looked out at the room. He did not look at Victor Hargrove. He looked at the people of Ridgefall County who had come to sit in this room on a Wednesday morning in the middle of winter. He said his name. He said he had been born in Ridgefall 57 years before the events in question and had been here every year since. He said he had known Victor Hargrove since they were both young men finding out what kind of men they were going to be. Then he said what he had come to say. He said it in the way he had told Cole he would say it, without self-justification and without the diminishment of context that would have made the picture of his decision more forgivable than it actually was. He said that Eleanor Wells had worked on his ranch in the summer of 1998 and that she had been a person of exceptional character and that she had been under pressure from Victor Hargrove regarding her land and that he, Earl Hale, had known this and had made the choice not to intervene because of a business calculation involving water rights. He said, "I chose the ranch over standing up for her." The room was very quiet. He said that Eleanor had given his wife an envelope before she left to be held for her daughter, and that he had kept that envelope through the years that followed, and that when a young woman named Clara Wells arrived in Ridgefall in October and sat down at his kitchen table, he had recognized what that arrival meant, and he had made a different choice than the one he had made in 1998. He said, "I am not here to be forgiven. I am here because Eleanor Wells deserves someone to say plainly what happened to her, and I am one of the people who knows what happened to her, and I am not willing to be quiet about it anymore." The cross-examination was brief and largely ineffective, not because the attorney did not try, but because there is a kind of testimony that cannot be undermined from the outside because it has already been undermined from the inside, already stripped of everything that could be attacked. And what remains is just the bare and undeniable fact of what a person did and what it cost. When Earl returned to his seat, Cole did not say anything. He put his hand on his father's arm for a moment briefly, in the way that men of a certain generation express things they cannot echo in, adequately put into words, and Earl nodded once, and that was all that needed to happen between them. Judge Sato took 40 minutes to review the submitted materials before she returned to the bench. She stated that the documentary evidence, particularly the contemporaneous note from Douglas Marsh, combined with the testimony of Margaret Pryor, provided sufficient grounds to open a formal county investigation into the validity of the 1999 deed transfer. She ordered a hold on all commercial activities on the parcel in question during the investigation period. She noted that if the investigation confirmed the alteration of a recorded legal document, the matter would be referred to the state attorney's office for further proceedings. She did not find in Clara's favor. She could not, at this stage on this evidence alone, but she found enough to put the machine of official scrutiny in motion, and in a county where Victor Hargrove had operated for 4 decades on the premise that the machine of official scrutiny would never be turned in his direction. This was a different kind of verdict than any number she could have delivered. Victor Hargrove left the hearing room without speaking to anyone. His attorneys flanked him as he walked, and the three of them moved through the room with the expression of people who have absorbed information they need time to process before responding to it. Dorothy Hargrove stood up from her seat in the front row. She did not follow her husband immediately. She stood for a moment, and then she turned and looked across the room at Clara, who was still at the petitioner's table speaking quietly with David Marsh. Clara looked up at the same moment as if some peripheral awareness had registered the weight of being looked at. The two women held each other's gaze across the room. Dorothy Hargrove's face in that moment was the face of a woman who has been carrying something for 25 years and has watched a portion of it leave her body in the course of a Wednesday morning hearing and does not yet know what to do with the space that the carrying occupied. It was not the face of defeat exactly. It was more complicated than defeat. It was the face of a reckoning that had been expected for so long that its arrival produced something closer to exhaustion than surprise. Then she turned and followed her husband out. Cole found Clara on the courthouse steps afterward, standing in the cold sunlight with her coat buttoned to the top and her hands in her pockets looking out at the main street of Ridgefall, the way a person looks at a place when they are trying to understand what it is to them. He stood beside her. Earl was a few steps below them talking to Margaret Pryor and Beth Carson, who was managing the business of getting Pryor back to the car with the careful logistics of someone who has thought through all the steps in advance. "It's not over," Clara said. "No," Cole said. "Investigation takes time. Hargrove's attorneys will work every angle they can. It'll be months before anything is resolved formally." "But it started." "It started," Cole said, "and it's on the record now. What my father said is on the record. What Pryor said is on the record." He looked at the street. In a town this size, what's on the record in a hearing room is also in every conversation in every place in town by tonight. Clara thought about that. About the 40 people who had sat in that room, most of whom had known the Hargrove family for their entire lives and had operated within the economic and social gravity of that family in ways they had mostly not questioned. About what it meant for them to have sat and listened to Earl Hale say plainly what he had done and why, and to have sat and listened to Margaret Pryor describe what she had seen at a county desk in 1999. About what it might change slowly in the way that things in small communities change not quickly or dramatically, but with the steadiness of water finding its level. 2 weeks after the hearing on a Thursday afternoon in late December, a vehicle came through the Hale Ranch gate at 4 o'clock. Cole saw it from the barn. He recognized the vehicle and he stood for a moment with a hay hook in his hand, watching it parked near the house, and then he set the hook down and walked toward the yard. Victor Hargrove got out of the driver's side. Dorothy got out of the passenger side. They came without lawyers. They came without the advance notice of a formal visit. They parked and they walked toward the house, and Cole came across the yard to meet them, and the three of them stood in the last of the afternoon light that was already going thin and amber in the way of winter light at elevation. Victor Hargrove looked older than he had at the hearing. Not dramatically older, not in the way of men who deteriorate rapidly under pressure, but in the way of a man who has been thinking hard for 2 weeks, and the thinking has been largely about things he cannot change. He was wearing the same barn coat. He looked for the first time in Cole's experience of him like a man who did not know in advance how the conversation was going to go. "I'm not here to negotiate," Victor said. "My attorneys will handle the legal side of things when the time comes. I'm not here about that." Cole waited. Dorothy asked to come, Victor said. She has something she wants to say to the Wells girl. I came because Dorothy asked me to. Cole looked at Dorothy, who was standing slightly apart from her husband, with her hands in her coat pockets, and her expression holding the same quality of controlled stillness it always held, but with something underneath the stillness that had not been visible before. Something that had been covered for a long time and was now only partially covered. Cole said he would see if Clara was available. He walked to the house and told Clara quietly that the Hargroves were outside. He did not tell her what to do with that information. He laid it out and let her decide. She looked at him for a moment. Then she took her coat from the hook by the door and put it on and went outside. Cole stayed inside. He watched through the window. He saw Victor Hargrove remain where he was, and Dorothy move toward Clara, and he saw the two women stand facing each other in the late afternoon light of the yard, and he watched the conversation happen without being able to hear it. He watched Clara's posture, which was the thing he knew how to read, the set of her shoulders and the angle of her head. He watched Dorothy, whose body language was something he had less experience reading, but which appeared over the 15 minutes of the conversation to undergo a gradual and unfeigned release of something that had been held in chronic tension. When Dorothy came back to her husband, she said something to him that Cole could not hear, and Victor looked across the yard at Clara, and for a moment the 58-year-old man, who had been the primary economic force in Ridgefall County for 4 decades, looked like something closer to his actual self than the version he typically presented. He said something to Cole, brief and direct, from across the yard without approaching. He said the investigation would find what it found, and he would not obstruct it. Then he and Dorothy got back in their vehicle and drove out through the gate. Cole went back outside. Clara was still standing where the conversation had ended, in the yard with the mountains behind her and the late light on her face. Cole came and stood beside her. What did she say? He asked. Clara was quiet for a moment. She said she remembered my mother, she said. She said my mother was the most stubborn person she had ever met, which I understood was meant as a compliment, even though it wasn't delivered as one. She paused. She said she was sorry. She said she knew it wasn't enough, but it was what she had. Cole looked at the gate, which had closed behind the Hargrove vehicle and was now just a gate again, the familiar weathered wood of the thing his grandfather had built. What did you say? He asked. I said thank you for coming, Claire said. They stood together in the yard as the last of the afternoon light went out of the sky and the cold came in completely, and the horses moved at the fence line in the darkening pasture, and the ranch held itself in the stillness of the end of a winter day. That evening after dinner, after the twins were in bed, Clara sat alone at the kitchen table with her mother's envelope. She had read the letter twice before. She had read the lawyer's note and understood its legal implications, and had discussed those implications with David Marsh in The Measured Language of People Managing a Formal Process. But there was a section of the letter she had not read aloud to anyone, and she had not examined too carefully herself because it contained something she had not been ready to hold. She was ready now. She unfolded the letter and found the section and read it slowly. Eleanor had written the letter in September of 1998, 6 months before the deed signing. The date was September 3rd, 1998. Earl had told her that Eleanor left the ranch in the first week of September. She had written it before the signing. She had written it knowing the signing was coming. She had written it knowing she did not have the resources or the support to prevent what was going to happen, but that it was possible to document what was happening accurately enough that the documentation might matter later. She had written, I am not afraid of Victor Hargrove. I am only afraid of having no one beside me when I face him. That fear is the thing I cannot fix from where I stand. Clara read that sentence 3 times, then she read the part she had been avoiding. Eleanor had written Clara, if you are reading this, you found Ridgefall. You found the ranch. I know you would find it because I know who you are, even though I won't be there to watch you become it. I carried you through everything that last year, and you were there with me for all of it, even the parts that were not good. And I want you to know that you were the reason I prepared all of this carefully instead of just running. You were the reason I thought about the future. The Hale Ranch is a good place. The people there are good people, not perfect, but good in the way that counts, which is that they know how to try again. I felt safe there in a way I had not felt safe anywhere else. I want you to have that. Not the land, not the legal case, not any of it. Just the feeling I had in that kitchen on a summer morning when the coffee was hot and the work was honest and I was somewhere that knew I was there. Let yourself stay. Clara folded the letter. She sat with her for a long time in the quiet kitchen of the house that Earl Hale's father had built in 1952, the same kitchen where her mother had stood 27 years ago, with the same mountains visible through the same window, and she held the letter and she let what it contained move through her without trying to manage it, which was something she had almost no practice in and was doing anyway. When she was ready, she put the letter back in the envelope. She set the envelope on the table. She looked at it for a moment longer. Then she turned it face down. Not to hide it, not to put it away, but because she was done needing to look at it in order to know where she was. She went upstairs and stood at the door of the girls' room. Both twins were asleep. Lily was taking up most of the available real estate with the sovereign confidence she brought to sleep as she brought to most things. June was on the far edge, curled on her side with one hand under her cheek, and her face in sleep had the openness that it did not quite have when she was awake, and the thinking being something she did almost continuously, and that kept a certain watchfulness in her expression, even in relaxed moments. Clara stood there for a while. Then she went to bed. She did not lie awake. The winter moved through December and into January with the inexorable patience of Wyoming winters, which did not hurry and did not relent, and asked of everyone living within them a quality of acceptance that was different from resignation, closer to the acknowledgement that certain things were simply larger than you, and the appropriate response was to work within their terms rather than against them. The county investigation proceeded. David Marsh communicated its progress to Clara and to Cole in the precise and measured language of legal process, which was the language of people who had learned to express uncertainty accurately rather than optimistically. The investigation was examining records that went back 25 years. Some of those records had been maintained well, and some had not. The outcome was not guaranteed. What was guaranteed, or as close to guaranteed as anything in human affairs could be, was that the outcome would be honest. Judge Sato ran a careful operation and was not interested in results that could be questioned later. Earl filled the winter months the way he filled all his months, with work and with the quality of presence that he had always brought to the ranch, the presence of a man who was finished with one thing and continuing with another. He was lighter in some way that Cole noticed and did not comment on the way you notice when a weight has been removed from something and register the change without requiring it to be named. He did one other thing. He drove to the cemetery on a Tuesday in January alone in the late morning when the frozen ground caught the flat winter sun and threw it back in all directions. He stood at Martha's stone for a while. Then he had the engraver add a line to the stone at the base. She was right. When Cole asked him about it, Earl said what he had said to June, that it was something a man should tell his wife more often while there was still time. Cole looked at him. About what specifically? About the Wells girl, Earl said. Martha told me in 1998 that we should do something, that we should find a way to help Eleanor. I told her it was complicated. He was quiet for a moment. She was right that it wasn't as complicated as I was making it. Cole thought about that for a while. Then he thought about it differently, which was to think about it as something finished rather than something ongoing, a thing that had been wrong and had been corrected as fully as it could be corrected by a man who was still in the world and capable of making corrections. He thought that his mother would have found that sufficient. In February, on a day when the temperature climbed above freezing for the first time in 3 weeks, Beth Carson came to the ranch for dinner. She brought a bottle of red wine from a vineyard in Colorado that she had been saving for an occasion, which she explained while she was opening it, and then explained further when Earl raised an eyebrow at what might constitute an occasion in early February in a county still waiting on a legal investigation. The occasion, Beth said, filling 4 glasses, is that I have known Cole Hale since his wife was my best friend, and I have watched him eat dinner alone at that table for 3 years, and tonight he is not eating dinner alone, and I consider that sufficient. Cole did not say anything. He picked up his glass. Clara looked at Beth Carson across the table with an expression that was very close to affection, which was a thing Beth produced in people fairly reliably by saying the honest thing at the moment when the honest thing was what the situation required. Earl said the wine is good, and that was the end of the commentary. Spring came to Wyoming with the unhurried authority of something that had been making its way toward you for a long time and had no need to announce itself because its arrival was simply the replacement of one condition with another. The brown and white of the winter fields giving way to the first green, that appeared along the creek lines and the south-facing slopes and then moved gradually outward across the pastures until the whole of the land was doing the thing that it did every year, which was to become itself again after the long pause. Clara was in the barn on an April morning when she heard the sound of small feet on the hay-covered floor. Both twins. She had heard them coming from the house, the sound of their approach, which was rapid and in tandem, and accompanied by the ongoing conversation they carried with themselves through most of their waking hours. Lily reached her first. June wants to show you something, Lily announced with the transparency of someone communicating information they have agreed to communicate but whose agenda they are not entirely committed to concealing. June came around her sister and held up a folded piece of paper. Clara took it and unfolded it. It was a drawing in crayon, the kind of drawing that a 5-year-old makes when she is drawing with full seriousness rather than with the exploratory casualness of art for its own sake. 4 figures stood in front of a house. The house had a porch and the 2 squares for windows and a triangle roof, and the kind of mountains in the background that lived in June's drawings as a permanent feature of the landscape she occupied. The tallest figure wore a hat, which was Cole. The figure beside him was shorter, which was Clara. 2 small figures stood in front of both of them. Off to one side, slightly separate, was a figure with silver hair, which was Earl. Below each figure, in the careful block letters of someone who had been working very hard at the alphabet, was a name. You drew us, Clara said. I drew family, June said. She said it with the matter-of-fact quality she brought to statements she considered self-evident, the quality of someone reporting rather than proposing. Clara looked at the drawing for a moment. She looked at the figure with her name under it, standing beside Cole with the 2 children in front and the mountains behind. It's a good drawing, she said. I know, June said. Lily, who had been waiting patiently through this exchange for longer than she usually waited for anything, said, Can we see the horses now? They saw the horses. Stormlight came to Clara the way he always did, with the direct and uncomplicated affection of a horse that has decided someone is worth knowing, pressing his large head against her shoulder, while Lily attempted to interest him in a discussion of her recent discoveries in the field of interesting rocks. And June watched everything with her arms folded and her head tilted in the considering way. Clara stood with her hand on Stormlight's nose and felt the warmth of the animal in the cool of the barn and the thin sunlight coming through the open doors. And she thought about a woman who had stood at the kitchen window of the house across the yard in the summer of 1998 and had looked at these mountains and had written 6 months before her life changed in a way she could not stop, that she wanted her daughter to have this. She thought that Eleanor Wells had been 23 years old in that kitchen, younger than Clara was now, alone in a way that Clara understood completely, and standing in a place that had made her feel known in a way she had not expected. Clara understood that completely too. She heard boots on the barn floor and did not need to look up. Cole came in from the morning chores and stopped at the entrance of the barn and looked at the scene in front of him the way he looked at things he was trying to understand correctly. His daughters and this woman and the horse in the light that came through the open doors and made everything in the barn look like it was inside something made of amber. He came and stood beside Clara at the stall. The twins were now engaged in separate projects. Lily was attempting to teach Dusty, the small brown dog, who had been living at the ranch since October and who had opinions about instruction, to sit on command. June was standing very still near the far stall, watching the old mare in a way that suggested she was thinking about something entirely unrelated to horses. Clara turned and looked at Cole. He looked at her. The investigation, he said. Marsh called this morning. They found a second document. Another version of the deed with the original clause intact. It was filed in a different folder. Possibly an oversight. Possibly someone who knew what they were doing wanted a record to exist somewhere. Clara took that in. It's enough, Cole said. Marsh said it's enough to conclude that the recorded deed was altered after execution. That changes the legal character of the transfer entirely. What does that mean practically? It means Hargrove will settle, Cole said. His attorneys will advise him to settle rather than fight the full case, because fighting the full case now means criminal exposure. Not just a civil dispute. He'll offer a monetary settlement. It won't be the land itself because the land has been developed, and there are complications with that, but it'll be a formal acknowledgement then that the transfer was improper and compensation at current value. Clara was quiet for a moment. My mother signed that paper 25 years ago, she said. Yes. She signed it alone. Yes, Cole said. She did. And now there's a record that says it wasn't right. There will be, Cole said. When the settlement is finalized, it will be in the public record of this county. Clara looked at Stormlight. She looked at the light coming through the barn doors. She looked at June, who had given up thinking about unrelated things and was now standing beside her sister, and both girls were attempting to instruct Dusty together with the earnest chaos of joint 5-year-old enterprises. That's what she wanted, Clara said. Not the land, the record. She paused. She wrote it in the letter. She wanted the truth in the record somewhere. Cole did not say anything. He stood beside her in the morning barn with the horses and the children and the light, and he let the moment be what it was. After a while, he said, I asked you once what you were thinking. You ask me that regularly, Clara said. I'm asking again. She looked at him. I'm thinking that I came here with one bag and a letter that turned out to be a trap, and I ended up somewhere that I don't fully understand yet, and that the not fully understanding is different than the not understanding I'm used to. The other kind was about not knowing where I stood. This kind is about standing somewhere that keeps showing me more than I expected. Cole looked at her with the directness he brought to things he intended to say accurately. Last fall, I told you my daughters needed someone like you, he said. That was the truth, and it still is. But I want to be clear about something. He paused. I was also talking about myself. Clara looked at him for a moment. I know, she said. He did not say more than that, and she did not either, because some things did not require more than what had been said, and both of them had learned in their different ways to trust the sufficiency of enough. That evening, Earl sat on the porch with June. The spring evening came down over the ranch, the way spring evenings came slowly, and with color, the sky going from blue to the mix of orange and rose that appeared on clear days when the light hit the clouds on the western horizon. June sat in the rocking chair beside Earl's with a piece of drawing paper on a clipboard and a box of crayons, working with the seriousness she brought to work she considered real. Earl had his coffee. He watched the light change over the mountains. After a while, he looked at what June was drawing. It was the ranch house. It was detailed in the way her drawings had become detailed over the past months, with the rocking chairs on the porch and the fence line going toward the far pasture and the mountains in the background, and 4 figures standing in front of the house. That's the same drawing you showed Clara this morning, Earl said. It's a better version, June said without looking up. Earl looked at the figures. The tallest one, the one with the hat, and the one beside it, and the 2 small figures in front, and the one off to the side with the silver hair. Who's that? He said, pointing to the silver-haired figure. June looked up with the expression of someone being asked a question with a self-evident answer. Grandpa Earl, she said. He's the one who holds everything steady. Earl looked at the drawing. He had not defined himself that way in a long time. He had not been sure what the accurate definition was, not since 1998, not since the long years of carrying something that had no clean name. He had been the man who made the practical choice and understood too late what the practical choice had cost. He had been the man whose wife had known better. He had been the man who kept the ranch going and kept the family going and kept himself going through the decades that followed with the work that the ranch asked for every day without pause. He had not been sure how to hold all of that together into a single image of who he was. A 5-year-old with a box of crayons had decided that the image was a man standing slightly apart, holding everything steady. He looked at the drawing for a long time. Then he put his hand on the top of June's head in the way he sometimes did briefly without comment, and she leaned into it slightly, the way she sometimes did. And then she went back to her drawing, and he went back to his coffee and the mountains and the last of the evening light moving across the ranch that his father had built and that he had kept, and that was still, after everything, exactly what it had always been. Inside through the window, he could hear Clara's voice and Cole's voice and the sound of Lily laughing at something and the ordinary percussion of the kitchen being put to rights at the end of a day. The sounds of a house that was full in the way houses need to be full, not with the forced occupation of people maintaining a form, but with the natural weight of people who were actually present. The light went off the mountains last the way it always did, the high peaks holding the color after the valley had gone to shadow, and Earl watched it go with the attention of a man who had watched it go from this same porch for 40 years and still found it worth watching. The spring was here. The work tomorrow would be what it always was, specific and physical, and requiring everything you had and offering in return the clean satisfaction of necessary things done in honest daylight. He finished his coffee. June finished her drawing and held it up, regarding it with the assessment of an artist who is deciding whether the work has achieved what it set out to achieve. Good, Earl asked. June tilted her head. Better, she said. Earl stood up slowly the way the hip required. He held the door for June and she went in ahead of him with her drawing and her crayons, and he followed her into the warmth and the light and the sound of the people inside, and the door closed behind him against the spring night. In the kitchen, Claire was standing at the window. She was looking out at the dark that had come down over the ranch, at the place where the fence line disappeared into it, and the horses were shapes rather than horses, and the mountains were present only as an absence of stars at the horizon. She was standing in the place where her mother had stood in 1998, in the kitchen that her mother had worked in for one summer 27 years ago, and she was looking out at the same mountains. Cole came in from the mudroom and saw her at the window. He came and stood beside her. Neither of them spoke for a while. She stood here, Clara said. Cole looked out the window. She stood here and looked at this, Clara said. And she thought it was worth saving something for. She thought the future was worth preparing for, even when the present was as hard as it was for her. She paused. I didn't understand that when I first read the letter. I thought she was being brave. Now I think she was just being a mother. Cole stood beside her and looked out at the dark ranch and the stars above it in the place where the mountains were. After a while, he said, she was right about the ranch. Yes, Clara said. She was. Outside, the spring night moved over the land the way it had moved over it every year since before anyone alive could remember. And the horses stood in the pasture in the dark, and the fence ran its line to the east toward the land that had belonged to Robert Wells, and then to Eleanor Wells, and that was now in the process of being accounted for in the records of Ridgefall County, and the house stood as it had stood since 1952, warm in the dark, full of the sounds of people at the end of a day. Clara had arrived here with one small bag and a letter that was a trap and the name of a place she did not yet know she was looking for. She had found what her mother had sent her to find. Not the land, not the legal resolution, not the formal acknowledgement that would eventually be entered into the county record, though that mattered and would always matter. What she had found was the thing her mother had written about from a room in a boarding house in Portland in September of 1998. The thing that Eleanor Wells had wanted for her daughter more than anything else she could think to want. A kitchen where she was known to be there. She was there. The window held the dark outside and the light inside, and Clara Wells stood at it with Cole Hale beside her in the house that had been waiting for her without knowing it was waiting, and she stayed.